The Laughing Painter by Priestess of Spiders on r/nosleep. It always raises a few eyebrows whenever I decline to participate in group pictures with friends, and I've received comments before on how frightened I looked on my passport photo. The simple truth of the matter is that after what I've experienced, I just can't stand the thought of having my picture taken. It used to just be a fear of being painted, but as time goes on, the memory of that awful, cackling woman and what she could have done to me has only intensified, like old food rotting at the back of the fridge that you've tried to ignore. It's getting hard to even look in the mirror now. I just keep thinking back to that damned portrait. I wonder where it is now. Possibly it is tucked away in some evidence locker, filed and catalogued under a case kept deliberately cold, but a horrible part of me believes that it is hanging on some stranger's wall somewhere. My face rendered in the nauseating style for the amusement of someone I will never meet. But it will be easy if I had some sort of proper answer to what happened. But as it is, I am simply forced to fumble in the dark for any kind of rational explanation, which more often than not fails to satisfy my curiosity. It doesn't help that the few therapists I've had approaching regarding this matter really take my account seriously, though none ever explicitly state their beliefs that it's all simply delusion. I wish it were all in my head. At least then it would make some kind of sense. I suppose it all really started when I got the job at the art gallery. It wasn't a great job really. The pay wasn't the best, and it certainly wasn't glamorous, but it was something to do out of college that wasn't just flipping burgers. The gallery was fairly small and possessed the same kind of dull, blank look that most of its ilk have. It was interior design that made itself unobtrusive, in an attempt to make you focus on the art itself rather than the surroundings, which wouldn't be a problem if the art we sold was any good. It's not as though any of it was bad, mind you, but our offerings were far from inspired. Workman-like depictions of old farms, sleepy cottages with glowing windows, and forest scenes that could have jumped straight out of a Bob Ross episode were the predominant themes. Occasionally, we'd get something more abstract, but these were rarely anything exciting. Just shapes and splotches of colour splattered haphazardly around, with little regard for balance or contrast. It made sense, I suppose, given the town gallery was located in. It was the sort of place where old folks went to die, and as a result, most of the artists who graced the gallery's otherwise blank white walls were painted with the shaky, inexperienced hands of retirees, to be viewed with failing eyes and purchased with dwindling pensioners. The bulk of my day-to-day work involved telling people not to touch anything and being asked for the titles and prices of various paintings we had on offer. Something that was decently frustrating, given the fact that both these things were generally listed right next to the work in question, right next to a sign that clearly stated, "Do not touch." The only real deviation from this routine was when we'd get one of our special customers. They never fit the mold of the rest of the visitors to the gallery. There were no shuffling feet and thrift store sweater vests, no cloying perfume failing to mask the telltale scent of old people smell. They were generally middle-aged, though a few were younger, and they wore well-fitted, expensive-looking clothes. Some of them had unplaced foreign accents, though they generally still spoke impeccable English. Those who didn't were typically accompanied by similarly well-dressed interpreters. Universally, they would walk in ignoring any of the items we had on display and ask to be directed to the private gallery. From there, it was my job to bring them to the attention of the gallery's owner, a woman named Charity Festerman. Miss Festerman was a slender, gaunt, frankly old woman who moved and spoke with all the grace of a black widow spider. Her face was lined with wrinkles and perpetually locked in a kind of Mona Lisa-esque wry half-smile, and she spoke with a polite but slightly aloof voice that always managed to make me feel suddenly embarrassed of my own way of speaking. She'd always greet these overdressed visitors as though they were old friends, guiding them back to the locked door labelled private gallery. Sometimes they'd spend hours in there before eventually emerging. the satisfied customers shaking my boss's hands before carrying off their prize in an opaque black bag. I'd asked Mrs. Festerman about the contents of the private gallery during my training, but had simply been told that it wasn't anything I needed to be concerned about. There was a certain tone in her voice that indicated any further questioning on this matter would be dealt with significantly less politely, and that it was in my best interest to drop the matter entirely. And so it went for several weeks. I would spend my shift bored to tears, idly wondering about what went on behind that locked door, which I wasn't allowed into, and occasionally reminding our more enthusiastic patrons to use their eyes, not their fingers, in approaching the mediocre offerings we had on display. This routine was disrupted when I met her for the first time. It was near the end of my shift at the gallery, and Mrs. Festerman and I were the only people remaining in the building. All of our visitors had shuffled home for an early bedtime about an hour ago, and I was mindlessly scrolling through social media on my phone when I heard the door open. "Just so you know," I said, not looking up from my screen, "we're going to be closed in about 15 minutes. All I heard in response was a loud giggle. Confused, I raised my head, and I saw standing before me a hunched-over, shabby-looking woman. She was thin as a rail, clad in layers of ill-fitting clothes, none of which looked or smelled as though they had been washed in some time. Her entire body was shaking, and the corners of her mouth were twitching as though unsure what sort of facial expression she wanted to make. In one of her gnarled claw-like hands, she clutched a large, rectangular black bag. I couldn't place her age exactly. She looked as though she had a lot of botched plastic surgery or Botox or something which would give her this weird, uncannily smooth appearance. My first assumption, of course, was the woman was homeless, but perhaps on the verge of a mental breakdown. "Hey," I asked, "are you alright, ma'am?" As soon as the words left my mouth, she dropped the bag to the floor with a thud that reverberated through the plain white room and rushed towards me. I yelped in surprise, flailing and cursing as I bucked up into the wall. The woman stopped only a couple of feet from me, staring intensely at me as she continued to twitch and shake. Then she began to laugh. It was a loud, seemingly uncontrolled sound, filling the entire gallery. It wasn't a happy laugh. The woman had tears in her eyes, her face contorted into a corpse-like grimace as she doubled over as though in pain. The sick and awful laugh, the sort of laugh a grieving mother chokes out between sobs at her own daughter's funeral. It made me feel like I was going insane just listening to it. I couldn't move, I couldn't do anything. I was just paralyzed with terror at this laughing thing that stood so close to me, who was poisoning my ears with terrible, raucous noise. I'm not sure how long I stood there, pressed against the wall with that woman laughing at me. Time didn't seem like it had any meaning anymore when I had to listen to that laughter, but eventually Miss Festerman came and laid a hand on the shoulder of the laughing woman, guiding her away in the direction of the private gallery. I hadn't seen her enter the room. She held the rectangular black bag in her hand. As soon as the two of them had entered the private gallery and shut the door, I felt as though I was able to move again. My heart was racing and I started crying. I didn't understand what had just happened, and I wanted to go home and hide under the covers like a child scared of the boogeyman. Then I heard a voice coming from behind the door of the private gallery. Muffled but clearly Miss Festerman. Shivering and choking back sobs, I went and listened at the door. It sounded like a conversation, or at least half of one. Every so often I'd hear the strange woman laugh again, a sound which set my teeth on edge even when muffled behind the door. And then Miss Festerman would respond as though she had said something. "Absolutely not. Can't. Draw far too much attention. Not after the last one. The police will. I see. Wait a moment." I heard footsteps, then the sound of the door being unlocked. I stepped back, trying to look as though I wasn't listening in. Miss Festerman's haggard face peered out from behind the store, her expression unreadable. "Were you eavesdropping?" I shook my head and I opened my mouth to speak, but Miss Festerman interrupted me, saying, "Go home for the night. I'll take care of closing the gallery." I nodded and I left without further word. As I walked out, I could feel eyes watching me from the still half-open private gallery door. But I didn't look back to see if it was Miss Festerman or the laughing woman. I didn't want to know. I spent the rest of the evening trying to relax. Normally, my go-to method of unwinding would be taking edibles, but I felt worried about the possibility of cannabis exacerbating my paranoia, so I settled on a few glasses of wine instead. I kept mulling over the day's events in my head, trying to arrange them into making some kind of sense. Who was the woman, and what was wrong with her? Why was she admitted into the private gallery? My thoughts drifted back to the bag she had been carrying, and I realized it must have held a painting inside of it. Was she an artist, perhaps? That helped me to calm down a little bit. Somehow, it was easier for me to rationalize her behavior if I managed to think of her as some kind of eccentric painter. There is a certain level of madness which is expected from creatives, and it was also entirely possible her bizarre behavior was just some sort of elaborate performance. My thought on the matter was interrupted by the sound of laughter drifting through my open window. I nearly dropped my glass in surprise. Had she followed me home? Carefully, I crept over to the window and peered outside. I live on the ground floor right next to a major street, and I was horrified at the thought that I might see her standing there, staring at me. Fortunately for me, it was nothing more than a false alarm. I saw a group of older women staggering along the sidewalk, cheeks flushed with drink and cackling among themselves as they headed home from a night of revelry. I let out a sigh of relief, but still decided to shut the window just in case. After I felt sufficiently buzzed to stop worrying about the day's events, I took a couple of Benadryls to help me sleep. Hard on the liver, I know, but I tend to suffer from bouts of insomnia, even at the best of times, and I knew that tonight I would need a little bit of help in getting to bed. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up. My body felt heavy and my head was clouded with a thick fog. The antihistamines have worked their magic. My thoughts weren't exactly coherent, to say the least, but I felt confused as to what I was doing awake. I rolled over lazily and checked my alarm clock. The time read 3:20 a.m. Exhausted, I rolled back over to my previous position and closed my eyes, trying to fall back asleep. That's when I heard it. A faint laugh coming from the window. I got out of bed, clumsily putting on slippers to spare my feet from the cold floor. In my daze, my thoughts drifted back to the drunken old women from earlier in the evening. They must have come back for more, I thought to myself. Yawning, I drifted across the room, preparing to shut the window that I had already closed hours ago. I didn't notice the laughing woman until I was fiddling with the latch of the window, and she let out a giggle, loud and maniacal, enough to be heard even from behind the thick glass. I screamed and I fell back, staring up at her grimacing face, dimly illuminated by the moonlight. She was pressed up against the window, grimy hands twitching as she began to laugh at me. I fell over, myself trying to escape her gaze, and in the process knocked over a chair, making a loud banging noise. My next door neighbor pounded against the wall angrily, shouting, "Hey, lady, keep it down, I'm trying to sleep." Scrambling to my feet, I looked back at the window, but nobody was there. It was as if she had simply disappeared. I didn't wind up calling the police, though I considered it. Frankly, I wasn't sure that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. Diphenhydramine, the active ingredient of Benadryl, has been known to cause unsettling dreams and even waking hallucinations in high dosages, and I couldn't be sure that what I had seen was anything real. I made sure my window stayed closed whenever I went to sleep, though from then on out, regardless of the temperature, I kept having this mental image of the woman crawling through it while I was sleeping, walking over to my bed. Well, I don't exactly know what I was expecting her to do after that, I just knew it would be terrible. I even dreamed about it a couple of times, but I always woke up right before she did whatever it is she was coming in there to do. I didn't see the laughing woman for a couple of weeks after that, and I had been trying somewhat unsuccessfully to put the whole incident out of my mind. The blandness of my routine made it all feel unreal. I began to wonder if I hadn't just imagined the encounter at my apartment, but the one at the gallery as well, and it all took on the quality of a fading bad dream. But even with the seeming return to normalcy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen, something that would make everything change. We still had the occasional special customer, of course, and I started to pay more attention to them. I couldn't shake the feeling like there was some sort of connection between them and the strange woman. I tried to find any sort of contact, connecting detail, any sort of unifying thread. I didn't find one. Eventually, I brought it up to the police during their investigation. After my final terrible revelation, but I don't think they really looked into it. You see, each of these strange customers wore a silver ring on their right pinky finger. One of them, a gentleman with a bald head so shiny I could practically see myself in it, shook my hand once, having initially mistaken me for Miss Festerman, and I was able to get a closer look at it. It wasn't just a simple silver band as it looked from a distance, but there was a symbol of Greek comedy mask, along with some writing that I didn't have time to make out. This made me feel sick to my stomach, and I asked Miss Festerman for the rest of the day off, which she granted me with a nonchalant wave of the hand. I began looking for other jobs after that, but in this economy, that is easier said than done, and I had to pay bills. I just tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly, awfully wrong, and that something horrible was going to happen very soon. She came back soon after that. This time, Miss Festerman and I weren't alone in the gallery. It was a bright sunny day, and there were at least 5 or 6 other patrons inside, staring slack-jawed and glassy-eyed at the middling work in the front of them, occasionally making some banal comment or another on the quality of this or that landscape, or scoffing at a more abstract work, mustering to themselves, "My grandson could have made that." It was so routine and monotonous that when the laughing woman walked in through the door, it was shocking, as if she had been the devil himself. I didn't even have time to process her sudden appearance before she was already doubled over and cackling, staring at me and stumbling towards me. Drool leaked from her pained open mouth as she practically screamed, white knuckles clutching at the black bag she dragged in with her. All of the patrons were staring wide-eyed at horror at this intruder into the quiet stillness of the gallery. One man asked his wife if she could call the police. The laughing woman dropped the bag and began running her fingers through her hair as she screamed laughed, pulling out matted bloody clumps. At this point, those who were closest to the exit had already started shuffling to the outside, anxious to be free of the disturbing intrusion. Miss Festerman quickly rushed over, grabbing the laughing woman and dragging her towards the private gallery. I'd never known her to have lost her composure before, but she practically yelled at me to get the other patrons out of the gallery. As Miss Festerman pulled the laughing woman past me, she lunged towards me, and I screamed as I tripped, backing away. Spittle flew from her mouth as she made horrible gasping laughs, eyes bulging, a drop of blood slowly dripping from her nose. "Get them out of here, now!" demanded Miss Festerman as she struggled with the laughing woman, and I stumbled to my feet, stammering as I tried as politely as I could to get the other gallery attendees out of the building. As I did so, Miss Festerman pulled the laughing woman into the private gallery and then shut the door. It didn't take long to convince the patrons to leave, and in less than a minute I was alone in the room. I could hear the laughing woman from behind the closed door, and the muffled voice of Miss Festerman. "Not here. Now of all times, not an option." I approached the bag that the woman had dropped on the floor. Evidently, Miss Festerman had forgotten to grab it in a rush to get the woman into the private gallery. My curiosity was eating me up, and I had to know what was inside. I reached for the bag and unzipped it slowly. Inside was a painting, as I expected, but from the side I had grabbed it, I could only see the back. I had one more opportunity to avoid seeing it. I still had a chance to leave it alone. I turned over the painting. A minute later, I called the police. By the time they got to the gallery, Miss Festerman and the laughing woman were gone. It happened shortly before the police arrived. The laughing and muffled arguments just abruptly stopped. The cops didn't believe me when I told them they had gone in the private gallery, as no one was inside and there were no doors or windows through which they could have left. There were, however, dozens upon dozens of paintings. They were all portraits, each depicting someone reading, cooking, watching television, or some mundane activity. They were uncannily realistic, but there was something about the lighting that felt subtly wrong, as though the subject's flesh was made of wax or plastic. In a way, it reminded me of how the laughing woman herself looked. Always the painting's perspective were of someone looking through the subject's window, while they were unaware of their observer's presence. The one I had found in the bag was a depiction of me, asleep in my bedroom. The clock by my nightstand read 3:12 a.m. The worst thing about it is I never got any closure. I didn't get an explanation for what happened to Miss Festerman and the Laughing Woman. I never figured out what was going on with those special customers. I could tell the police were holding something back from me, but they wouldn't tell me what it was. The only other piece of the puzzle I got, I had to find for myself. I had wound up taking a couple of pictures of the paintings after the police had opened the private gallery. I don't know why, I guess maybe I wanted some sort of proof of what happened. I didn't actually take a picture of my own portrait. The point is, when I was looking over the pictures after the fact, one of the people in the paintings looked familiar to me. I recognized her as a regular of the gallery, one of the few people I could remember by name, a woman named Linda Anderson. She had made a few purchases and was friendly enough with me. I realized I hadn't seen her for a few weeks. A quick online search turned up a website set up by her family, offering a reward for any information about her whereabouts.